Welcome back to FluteTube, where I can promise you that we're never going to go and try to brine a turkey in the Great Salt Lake for Thanksgiving, but I can also promise you that we'll do our very best to meet all of your nerdiest flute player knowledge needs. I can't take the words straight out of his mouth, but Michelangelo, the sculptor, famously said that every block of stone has a sculpture inside it, and it is the task of the sculptor to discover it. He viewed sculpting as discovering a pre-existing form. And I don't know about you, but when I brought my flute home, not this one, but my original flute, back when I was 9 for the first time, I felt kind of the same way. Maybe you did too, that this flute was bound to turn out just as we have it now. But as you learn more about what the flute used to be like decades and centuries ago, you realize that a lot of choices were made to bring the flute to this point where we have it today, and that a lot of those choices really could have been different. Numerous choices were made by flute makers and also by flute performers who took ideas of flute makers and said, no, we want this to be different. My FluteTube episode today, and also the episode next week, which will be a part 2 for this one, is going to be a really important one for any flute nerds out there. And it's great to be a flute nerd. So I hope at least today and next Friday, that term can apply to you. We're going to talk about 3 keys that were proposed by various makers to be on your current flute, but for various reasons, these 3 keys were basically rejected. We've talked before here on FluteTube about some of the choices of flute makers regarding how they came to decisions about various parts of your flute. The biggest I've mentioned in the past is our flute's G and G sharp keys. Theobald Boehm, who was the single biggest influence on how our modern flute has turned out today, wanted the G and G sharp keys to be configured differently. In fact, if we'd done what Boehm wanted, they would be much simpler mechanically. If we'd stuck with his ideas that he had in the mid-1800s, basically we would have had C, B, A. This would have hit a key that created a G sharp, and then this pinky would have hit a key that created G natural, which is basically more logical and also would have created a noticeably simpler flute mechanism. A few places in the world do still create the flute the way that Boehm had envisioned, giving a simpler, what's called an open G sharp key. But most places in the world have unquestionably complicated Boehm's original plan for the flute mechanism by rejecting that open G sharp key. I won't go into that more now. If you want to know a lot more, you can watch the episode that I made about all of this called The Fascinating History of Your G Sharp Key. But I will quickly say that as a consequence of rejecting Boehm's open G sharp key, there were other problems that were created. For instance, we now have the option when we purchase a flute to buy one with a split E mechanism, which I do have on my flute. And that would be completely unnecessary if we had not rejected Boehm's plan for an open G sharp key. If you want to know more about that, I'm not going to go into it right now, but I will link to my episode about why you might be interested in a split E mechanism. Back to these 3 keys that were basically rejected by flute makers. They were all good ideas, but none of them are on our default current modern day flute. I'm going to go in chronological order. So today we'll talk about the 2-keyed flute that Quantz invented. Johann Joachim Quantz first began to research how to make flutes back in 1739. So this was quite a while ago. And if you want to know more about Quantz, I'll link a video I made about him. But basically, Quantz was Frederick the Great's flute teacher. Quantz was important to the history of the flute in a number of ways, including writing this huge, famous treatise we still refer to all the time called On Playing the Flute. And he wrote this for Frederick the Great. Now, if you have some flute background, perhaps you've heard of the 1-keyed flute. This is the flute that became standard-ish around 1670. If you've studied a little bit about the history of the flute, perhaps you already know what that single key was. Do you? If not, take a guess, leave it in the comments. What do you think would be the most helpful key? If you have not heard of the 1-keyed flute, what I think you should do is pause the video and think through, if you had no keys on your flute, which is the one key that you would add that would most help you? Pause the video and think about that. Okay, are you ready for me to tell you the answer? The first key that was added, and I'm looking at my piccolo because the mechanism is simpler, was this right hand pinky key. Once you give it some thought, it's quite logical why this would be the most useful key. It's because all the other holes would be open and you'd close them with fingers. And if you've closed all of these, you would get the lowest possible note on the flute, which would be a D. And if you lift a finger, you get E, F, G, A, B, C. But think about, how do you get chromatic pitches? How would you get an A flat? How would you get an F sharp? Well, if you're playing a note up here, like an A or a B, you can add fingers down the tube that bring the pitch down. But if all of your fingers are down and you want an E flat, your only option is to kind of scoot this lowest finger off of the hole on that keyless flute and somehow find an E flat. And that's not the ideal solution unless you want an extended technique where you slide the pitch. So if they added one hole here towards the very end of the flute, and they added a key that's a lever to push down and open that one hole, then it becomes very easy to get E flat or D sharp. All right, that was a quick bit of background, but knowing that background is really going to help you figure out about this two-keyed flute. So now that we've discussed the one-keyed flute and you've thought through what is the single most useful key to have, now think through, if you were going to add one more key, your second key, which would it be? What's the most useful key after that E flat? If you already know, you're probably really like a flute graduate student, or you completed a master's or doctorate or something in the flute. Most people don't know. It's not what you would think. If you don't know, again, I'd say pause the video and try to figure it out. Okay, here's the answer. This came as a big surprise to me when I learned it. Adding a second key, what Quantz decided needed to be done was to add, in fact, a second right-hand pinky key. I think this is pretty funny because I did a video about the right-hand pinky's extra workload, and I talked about how this right-hand pinky is the only finger that's responsible for so many different pitches. It gives you E flat, taking it off gives you D, C sharp, C, B. You got the gizmo key down here. Well, if our modern flute had preserved some of what Quantz wanted to do with the flute, we would have not only an E flat key, but the second pinky key he added, which was for D sharp. So even way back in the 1700s, Quantz was adding to this poor right-hand pinky's extra workload by giving it not only an E flat lever to push, but also a D sharp lever to push. Why do you think he would do that? Answering that question requires some knowledge of how old flutes worked. Since there were only one or two keys, and since we can only count on flutists to use 10 fingers at an absolute maximum, many pitches like sharps and flats were made by what they'd call back then cross fingerings. You would finger your pitch and then you'd add various other fingers to change that pitch, and you had different options depending on how much you needed the pitch to change, because tuning was much, much less standardized, not only for the flute, but for all instruments in general. In this big treatise by Quantz, he talks about tuning quite a bit, of course, and he includes fingering charts. You can find examples of fingering charts that have a lot of cross-fingering options listed. You wanted lots of options so that you could not only play something like an F sharp, but you could make the F sharp higher for some situations, lower for other situations. Take a look at this interesting fingering chart, because Quantz lived in this interesting world of cross-fingerings and constantly dealing with pitch questions. And if you have an E flat lever that gives you an E flat / D sharp, that's only one option, and you really want both an E flat and a D sharp option. We're used to thinking of those as being almost exactly the same pitch, but they're really not. And back in these days where tuning needed to be so flexible and needed to be easy to not only play both E flat and D sharp, but various gradations of all the pitches that you could, it is actually quite logical that Quantz wanted to create more options to play not only an E flat or only a D sharp, but really both. So just think, if Quantz's two-keyed flute had caught on, we could have had not only these low keys to deal with and the E flat to deal with, but another additional D sharp lever here. Quantz, I'm talking to you. It was a really good idea. It shows that you're really a top-notch flutist. You cared so much about pitch, and that was really important to be a top-notch flute player, even back in the 1700s, especially back in the 1700s. But sadly, I can see where it was a kind of complicated idea. And sadly, I can see why it never became mainstream. But truly, a huge thanks for everything, Quantz. Come back next Friday and we'll talk about 2 more keys that your flute could have had, but doesn't, most likely. You have to really go looking for these keys. I can't tell you right now what these 2 keys are because it's so interesting and I can't afford to be scooped by all the other great flute channels that are out there. So you'll have to come back next week. In the meantime, have a wonderful week ahead from FluteTube.